Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Karen Jonas, titled Oklahoma Lottery. So, okay. Here's the problem in the internet age that only critics will really complain about. With the advent of iTunes and Bandcamp, it has become very easy for a lot of music to be released independently, which more often than not is a very good thing, as it allows artists to retain their unique sound and flavor and not get hammered into a marketable brand by the label system, and for the most part retain some of the profits. But what it also means that if I only covered new releases that showed up on Bandcamp and released reviews 365 days a year, I would still fall even more hopelessly behind than I already am. As such, when an act from the independent country scene that I've never heard of starts getting some very serious critical acclaim, I step up and take notice, especially when I start to hear that one of her biggest selling points is in her songwriting. Now this takes us to Karen Jonas from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and her debut album, Oklahoma Lottery. Apparently she has less of a web presence than I do, which for an indie act building buzz, it's a little startling, but then again, it's a little more excusable than mainstream country acts that have the exact same problem. And as always, before going into this album, I tempered my expectations. Even though one of my favorite albums of the year thus far is the Texas indie country release Daylight and Dark by Jason Eady, I'm also very conscious of the fact that some critics can tend to upsell indie acts that catch them by surprise in a good way. Look, it's a natural human instinct, and sometimes it can eclipse critical thought and analysis. So with all that in mind, I bought Oklahoma Lottery from Bandcamp and gave it my fair due listens. Did Karen Jonas deliver? Well, yeah, she really did, because Oklahoma Lottery is a great country album that I definitely enjoyed and really does a lot right. This is the sort of strong, independent debut as both a performer and as a songwriter that should, if there's any justice whatsoever, get a lot of industry attention. And yet, at the same time, it's also an album with a unique flavor that separates her out from a lot of other rising talents. She's not as actively abrasive as Lydia Loveless, nor as socially conscious and occasionally quirky as Kacey Musgraves. For me, Karen Jonas falls into a very similar vein of maturity as Brandy Clark's excellent debut last year with 12 Stories, albeit with a very different tone than with that record than this record has. So, okay, what makes Karen Jonas stand out? Well, for one, her instrumentation is solid as hell, with her well-picked acoustic instrumentation providing great balance for a selection of cohesive, well-chosen guitar tones, well-balanced bass, and surprisingly textured percussion. In fact, there's a fair amount of grit on the edges of this album that I really did appreciate, which I honestly didn't actually even expect going in, given the smoother guitar tones that they chose. It lends this album a richness and a sense of place and rural Americana without ever overwhelming the basic country sound. It's flavor, but the grit is a great balance for the darker yet very human elements on this album. Now, if I were to have a small nitpick with the production, it would be that there could be some greater dynamics on this album. Most of the track placements, especially Karen Jonas's vocals, they feel very close to the very front of the mix, which gives the album a lot of intimacy, to be sure, and that can work, but the mix could have had a little bit more depth to let some of the excellent strumming on the acoustic instruments grow and really simmer in the mix. Now, granted, I completely get why Karen Jonas is placed as close to the front of the mix as possible, because she has a real presence on this album that really requires a delicate emotional balance to execute in these songs, and she delivers it. She has that real air of bitter tiredness that lends a lot of humanity and reality to her songs, and it's an authenticity that has range and real character. Suicide Sal, the title track, I Never Learned, Lucky, they all require a certain level of weary resignation to pull off effectively, and you know what? She nails it. On the flip side, she also has something of a sense of humor, and that works for her, and it lends the album's cornier bits a fair bit of real charm. On the other hand, I won't say that she's bad in the love songs, but her range isn't quite as expressive, and thus Stepping on Your Toes and Thinking of You Again, they don't really resonate with me as strongly as I was hoping. Now, don't get me wrong, they're still very good songs, but especially in Thinking of You Again, there's an underlying melancholy to the song in the lyrics that I don't think that she completely captures in her vocal delivery as well as she could. Now, thankfully, she more than makes up for this in the songwriting, where I'd argue the real star potential on this album really comes to light. I feel I should mention a few odd breaks in technical rhyme scheme and a few lyrics that probably could have used a few more drafts, but Karen Jonas, quite frankly, brings a ton of wit and descriptive power to her tracks to enhance the grit of her instrumentation, and her artistic framing is impeccable, adding a sense of vulnerability and added weight to her material as she inserts herself into the majority of her stories. It makes even her flights of dark fantasy, like on Suicide Sal, feel real, even though it's just another play on the Bonnie and Clyde story. But it's where she goes for more original subject material, or at least more nuanced subject material, that I feel this album really brings out something impressive. Get Out of My Head is a message to an ex to move on that is clearly delivered with some lingering feelings toward the guy in question, which she knows will be easier to put aside for her. She knows it'll be easier for her to get over this guy once that he's found somebody new. And then there's I Never Learned, which places her as the other woman in a cheating story, where she's the one who steps up to deliver a violent ultimatum, even amount the complicated emotions in that song. And you know, as silly as white trash romance is, there's so much flavor and real charm in the lyrics that you can mostly ignore the cornball sensibility in which it was written. I dug it, it worked for me. But if we're gonna go for a theme and go a little bit deeper on this album, it's more of a subtle, weary acknowledgement that sometimes, despite all your choices and all your effort, life doesn't always work out the way you want it to. And sometimes we just have to keep trying to make something of it in the end, even if that's a Sisyphean task. And it's that sense of desperation into achieving something that of their own that gives this album its dramatic weight. The title track, for instance, Oklahoma Lottery, it discusses a drought that devastates a small community and how to reconcile it with a belief in a loving God, all of which nearly drives Karen Jonas to leave for California to pursue that hollow dream, except she realizes that Oklahoma is where her home is and she can't exactly abandon that. And then take a song like Money, which is a little bit more straightforward in its desperate plea, but you know what, it works for me simply because the lyrics don't hold back from the terrified anger that comes from that form of poverty. And Lucky might be the most ambitious song on the album and one of the best, capturing the hard-bitten air of a professional gambler, both in money and in love, and concealing the veiled warning that you don't see her when things go wrong. Now, all that being said, I feel that the weaker songs on this album are when the stakes are not as harsh and they don't feel as defiantly real. Thinking of You Again comes back here. It's a great encapsulation of that late night call to an ex, and it's very well framed enough in the lyrics to capture both some of the desperation that drove her to make the call and the resignation that hookup, it's just not gonna happen. But I feel the emotional delivery probably could have been a little bit stronger. Similarly, the River song, it's a good melody about personal redemption. I really like the hook of the song, but it feels a little bit out of character with the rest of the record, and it didn't quite resonate with me in the same way. But you know what? Overall, Oklahoma Lottery by Karen Jonas, it's excellent and definitely worth your time if you want to find some heartfelt country that has the air of reality. It's not a perfect album by any stretch of the mind, as some of the elements in the production, songwriting, and delivery could do with a few minor adjustments and polish to make it a little bit more powerful. But for a debut album, it's a very impressive start, especially off of an independent release. For me, 8 out of 10 and a strong recommendation. And major labels, if you're watching this, if you're looking for more strong women in country music, and with Casey Musgrave's continued critical acclaim, I know you are, you all need to give Karen Jonas a listen, because she's definitely the real deal. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out that you'd like me to hear, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. But until then, I'm Mark, and I'll see you next time.